Hello. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Tyler. And thank you to Olga and Jason and your entire team for creating such an amazing event where we can find each other and create some community. Okay. My name is Jodi Shaw, as you know. I'm 52 years old. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a mother, an artist, and former librarian. I was, and still am, fiercely independent, creative, open-minded. I like to think of myself as a free thinker. And up until a few years ago, I believed myself to be a free woman. I thought I knew what freedom was. As it turns out, it was not until 2018, shortly after I began working at Smith College, a very prestigious liberal arts institution, where I went through a series of very painful reckonings. I learned the hard way that just because we can move freely through space, choose our own professions, choose our spouse, where we want to live, etc., doesn't necessarily mean we are free. I think, as many of you know, we are in a war, and the war is not being fought with guns or bombs. The battlefield of this war is inside our own brains. And as long as we are forced to engage in this war, that is, as long as our brains are being used as a battlefield, we are not free. Matthias Desmet, who wrote The Psychology of Totalitarianism, said it best when he said, "This is not a political problem, this is a psychological problem." Now, he made this statement during the time of lockdowns, but I believe it's also applicable to the problems I encountered at Smith College and to many of the issues we're facing in our culture today. What he's getting at is that we are all vulnerable to manipulation, whether we consider ourselves on the left, the right, or libertarian, simply by virtue of our wiring as human beings, simply by virtue of having a brain. So I'm here to tell you the story of how I, an unwitting soldier in this cognitive war, managed to extricate myself from one small layer of what I now know to be a multi-pronged attack on our freedom. This is the story of how I went from this happy librarian working at Smith College a few short years later to this, and speaking before you today. So, thank you. Now, before I get into the meat of my talk, which is about woke, I want to preface it with a definition of critical social justice, which is what we colloquially refer to as woke, okay? I want to define it here carefully because when I say things like the ideology or social justice, we can all know exactly what I'm talking about because we all have different ideas of what woke means, right? So bear with me, these next few slides are a little academic, but it's very important we're on the same page. So I've adapted this description, what is critical social justice, from Helen Pluckrose's essay, What Do We Mean by Critical Social Justice? Thank you, Helen. So, what is critical social justice? Okay, I'll read it. You don't have to read it. It's a theoretical approach to addressing issues of prejudice and discrimination on the grounds of characteristics like race, sex, ethnicity, so on and so forth. So in other words, your immutable characteristics for the most part. So it's a theoretical approach to addressing prejudice. It holds that knowledge is not objective. Knowledge is not objective, but culturally constructed in order to maintain oppressive power systems. And these oppressive power systems, which are believed to permeate everything, are called things like white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, heteronormativity, etc., etc. I think you've probably heard at least some of these terms before. However, it is believed that most of us cannot see these oppressive discourses because they're just the water that we swim in. It is the marginalized, okay, who have the ability to see these things and therefore have the authority to call them out and define them. Critical social justice theorists and activists apply their critical methods to analyze systems, language, and interactions in society to uncover these power systems and make them visible to the rest of us. Hence, theories like critical race theory, aka CRT, I'm sure you've heard of it. This is just one pillar. This is critical social justice is an umbrella, and CRT is one pillar of this ideology. It is believed in this ideology that social justice can be achieved provided that the rest of us accept our moral imperative to pay attention and accept these interpretations. This is referred to as doing the work or educating yourself. And here's the kicker. So here's the thing. Here's the key part. Any skepticism or doubt of this ideology is seen as proof of the ideology. And what I mean by that is, if you are a member of the privileged group or power group, so for example, if you are a straight white man and you express doubt or skepticism of this ideology, then that is seen as you wanting to cling to your power and to continue oppressing people. If you are not a straight white man, if you are a female, for example, or if you are not white, and you express doubt or skepticism of this ideology, that is seen as evidence of your own internalized oppression, meaning you are oppressing yourself, and you just don't know it. This is otherwise known as the Uncle Tom syndrome. I think you know what that is. Okay. So I know that in the program it's called Waking Up to Woke, but I use the term skin deep here because my particular fight had to do with my skin color, my race, and I use the word soul, but as it turns out, this was not a battle for the soul of Smith College. It really was a battle for my own soul, my own brain, and my own freedom. So, many of you know I was an employee of Smith, but what not a lot of people know is that I also graduated from Smith. It's my alma mater. I graduated in 1993, a degree in anthropology. At Smith, I learned how to conduct research, I learned how to analyze, I learned how to defend an argument, and I learned the importance of things like context, history, class, so on and so forth. Now, I certainly continued to hone these skills after I graduated, but Smith was really my launch pad. Now, as we all know, college is about a lot more than academics. Smith College is located in Northampton, Massachusetts. The Northampton of the late 80s and early 90s was, to me, a Shangri-La. It was a liberal, artsy, intellectually sophisticated town. It was the perfect place for a budding young feminist to come of age. And come of age I did. I blossomed at Smith, socially, intellectually, and politically. So when I say this battle is personal, that's because, for better or for worse, Smith is an integral part of who I am. So, a little bit about me. I'm going to dive into the story. I was born in Canada to American working class parents. We moved around a lot, but I ended up in the great state of New Hampshire, where I finished out grade school and high school. I was not an amazing student by any means. But when Smith came onto my radar via a beloved teacher, I applied, and lo and behold, I was accepted. After I graduated from Smith, a girlfriend and I drove around the country looking for a place to live. We had spent 4 years in the liberal utopia of Northampton, Massachusetts, and now we were ready to upgrade to a larger model. Well, we found one. After living in Portland, Oregon for 5 years and a brief stint in New Mexico, I returned back east to Brooklyn, New York, where I spent 16 years of my life, the longest I've lived in any single place, living a hand-to-mouth existence as a musician. I performed on stage, and I spent many late-night hours busking on the subway platforms. Now, if you ever want to have your assumptions about humanity exploded, in a good way, try busking the subway platforms of New York City from the hours of 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. on weeknights and weekends. So after the birth of my sons, I realized I needed a real job, so I went back to school and I became a librarian. I started working at Brooklyn Public Library, which arguably has the most diverse staff and clientele on the planet. Around this time, my husband and I started the process of divorce, no longer able to afford Brooklyn, and wanting to raise my children in an open, safe, liberal environment with other people like myself. I relocated with my children back to Northampton in 2017. And I was ecstatic to land a position, a dream job at Smith College as a librarian. It was only a temporary position, however, so my plan was I was going to work my ass off, and I was going to land a permanent position, and I was going to stay at Smith College until I retired. I had it all worked out. Almost right away, I knew something was wrong. And what I mean by this is that something didn't feel right. It was at Smith in 2017 when I first heard that systemic racism is a big problem on campus. And not only on campus, but in the entire country. I also first heard at Smith about things like white privilege, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was told that I harbor implicit racial bias simply by virtue of my skin color. My behavior does not matter, simply by being white. That none of these things were ever clearly defined, these words, equity, inclusion, diversity, that none of them were ever clearly defined or seemed to be supported by any actual evidence, even my own senses, only bothered me a little, and that's because I trusted Smith. Remember, Smith is my alma mater, and the town of Northampton is where I came of age. These were my people. Furthermore, I thought, the people that run the college have a lot more experience than I do and a lot more education. Surely they know what they're talking about. Surely they've looked into this stuff. Plus, they're liberals. What could go wrong? I also, however, sincerely wanted to help. Here I was being told that not only is systemic racism a big problem, but that I, as a white person, can somehow dismantle it completely simply by showing up to meetings and talking about my white privilege over ham and cheese sandwiches. I thought, why not? Of course. So I went along with it for a while. It's cliche to say that even when people recognize injustice, they don't take action unless it affects them personally. And I'm no exception in that regard. And even when it did affect me personally, I still didn't take action right away. Why? Because recognizing injustice, as it turns out, is not always an easy thing to do, let alone take action. I couldn't even begin to think about taking action until I was able to fully articulate to myself what exactly the problem was. Remember, all I knew was that something didn't feel right. For a long time, I lacked the moral conviction necessary to take action. And let me tell you, in order for somebody to stick their neck out in the way that I eventually did, one must be very certain that what they are doing is the right thing. So what happened? Well, my story at Smith really begins about a year after I started working there, with a seemingly unrelated incident that occurred on July 31st, 2018. On this day, a white custodian called campus police to report that somebody seemed out of place in a campus dining hall. This was during the summer in a dining hall that happened to be closed, I want to add. That somebody was Black sophomore Umu Kanute. Now, Umu was convinced that the custodian's behavior had been racially motivated, and she posted as such to her Facebook page. Well, the post went viral, and soon the story, that is, the students' version of the story, was the version heard round the world. So now we have hundreds of thousands of eyeballs all gazing at Smith College. The college administration responded swiftly by issuing multiple public apologies to the student and announcing their intention to launch several new initiatives, all aimed at dismantling racism and racial bias, of which apparently this incident had been an example of. Now, notably, Smith began issuing these apologies and announcing these initiatives before it had even started investigating the student's allegations. And it continued to do so even while the investigation was pending and after the conclusion of the investigation, which found no evidence of racial bias. So think about what kind of messaging this sends to everyone on campus, many of whom have no other information than what the college was telling them about the incident. We're going to get to that. So at the time, I heard about the incident the same way everyone else on campus did, which is what one of these many emails the administration was sending out. And frankly, I was shocked. I thought to myself, damn, how could something like this happen at such a liberal and progressive institution? Somebody called campus police just because there was a black student in a dining hall? That's terrible. This systemic racism stuff must be real. And if it can happen at a place like Smith, surely it must be rampant across the entire country. I also remember thinking that the fact that I was surprised that something like this could happen at Smith must be evidence of my white privilege. So now we see here how this kind of incident, hyped up and broadcast in the way that it was, to faculty, staff, and students who have no other information than what the college and several media outlets are telling them, can be used as evidence to prove an entire belief system. And for anyone who doubts, it can be used as a cudgel to beat them over the head to toe the party line. So at some point, the student, now emboldened by the support of an entire institution and all news outlets, all pushing her version of events, demanded to know the identity of the custodian who had called campus police. Well, Smith did one thing right. They refused to divulge that information. Well, the student took matters into her own hands and announced her intention to seek justice. She searched through the Smith staff directory and found 2 individuals, not 1, 2, that she believed were involved in making this phone call. She posted the names and photographs of these 2 staff members to her Facebook page, which, remember, has hundreds of thousands of eyeballs looking at it. These 2 staff members were custodian Mark Patnaud and dining staff worker Jackie Blair. Both longtime employees of Smith, both white, and neither one of them involved in any way in making the phone call. However, thanks to the student, they now had lots of eyeballs on them, many of whom belonged to people who believed quite firmly that these 2 are utterly racist. And let's face it, there are few things worse in our culture right now than being branded a racist. Now, the student did end up removing their names and photographs from her Facebook page, but the damage was done. Mark Patnaud left the college almost immediately and never returned. He's now on disability. And Jackie Blair, she stayed at the college for a few years more, but she was mercilessly harassed by students right up until she left a few years later. Now, although the college issued multiple public apologies to the student for an unsubstantiated allegation, it did not do the same for these staff who had been defamed by the student, nor did they discipline the student who had obviously engaged in behavior in harassment, which is a violation of the student handbook. On October 28th, 2018, an independent investigation concluded that the caller to campus police had had a legitimate reason for doing so, that there was no evidence of racial bias. However, the next day, President Kathy McCartney issued her own statement saying, yes, but it is impossible to rule out the potential role of implicit bias. Thus, McCartney cemented the public perception that these staff are racist, and by extension, that everyone on all staff, all white staff, are racist. Now, as you know, I had drawn my own conclusion about the incident early on. I was shocked. I thought it was terrible. But I wasn't paying much attention by the time the student had posted the names and photographs of these staff members to her Facebook page. And that is because at the time, I was going through my own racial incident in the library. I had been working for several months. As you know, I was a temporary librarian, and I was trying to get a full-time permanent position. I had been tasked to work on a project to create a wild and crazy library orientation for 600 first-year students. So when I thought to myself, what's the best way to transmit a lot of very boring information to 600 exhausted first-year students, the answer seemed obvious to me. It was a rap, of course. Now, in late August, so I worked for several months on this presentation, and in late August, about a month after the July 31st incident and a week before the orientation, my supervisor approached me and said, "You can't do the rap." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Whoops, because you're white." Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this part of the story, rest assured, Rolling Stone has covered it. They claim I was not discriminated against so much as saved from humiliating myself, because apparently middle-aged white women can't rap. Well, if you have doubts, please check out my YouTube channel. I did end up releasing the rap on my own, and decide for yourself. Okay? Back to the story. My supervisor reiterated this statement in an email, and he also cited this summer's incident, the July 31st incident, as evidence, as justification for saying I couldn't do the rap because I'm white. So I was shocked. I was humiliated, and I was very confused. I thought, this feels like racial discrimination to me. And yet, it was so blatant. There was no hesitation, and it was fully documented in an email. I thought, this does not compute. Here was Smith screaming its head off about its commitment to racial justice in response to an as of yet unproven accusation of racial bias. And here I was, facing what seemed to me to be blatant racial discrimination, which is illegal. And not only that, but the July 31st incident had been used as justification to discriminate against me. I can't emphasize enough how mind-bendingly difficult it was for me to wrap my mind around what was happening. I thought about filing a complaint, I did, but I was racked with self-doubt. I honestly didn't know if this was racial discrimination or not. It seems obvious now, I know, probably to you, but back then I was not sure. And now I'm touching on one of the psychological issues that is a hallmark of this ideology in action, which is that because this ideology assumes that only marginalized people can see and point out oppression, the rest of us are required to doubt and even deny the reality of our own senses. And that's exactly what I was doing. This has another name, by the way. It's called gaslighting. I did seek advice. I met with an HR rep. I met with the ombudsman, both of whom are ostensibly trained in the art of recognizing racial discrimination. I told them everything that had happened, and neither one of them framed it as discrimination. In fact, both of them advised me to simply leave that position. It's not working out. find another position. Talk about self-doubt. So by this time, I had the strong impression that it didn't matter whether I thought it was discrimination or not. If I pushed on this anymore, I'm not going to work at Smith ever. I'm not going to get a job there. I'm never going to work there again. And I really needed a job. I really wanted a permanent position. So I stayed at Smith, but I left my career as a librarian. I withdrew my candidacy for the position I was up for, and I took a position in the residence life department. My new job consisted of helping students with very practical matters: ID cards, keys, room assignments, that kind of thing. I took a substantial pay cut, but the loss in wages was outweighed by the hope that here in residence life, I could fly below the racial radar. I was wrong. My first week in residence life, I was handed a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, an academic tome, by the way, which I don't think any of my colleagues actually read. Well, what's wrong with social justice anyway? It sounds good, right? Social justice. And here we have another psychological problem, which has to do with language. I'm thinking to myself, social justice, that sounds like a good thing. It sounds like something we would all want. And yet, now I and other staff members have been hurt in the name of social justice. So I was deeply conflicted at this point. In Res Life, I was told I would be expected to create a curriculum grounded in social justice principles. Remember, I'm just helping students get keys and with room assignments, and I'm being told I have to help develop a curriculum, a social justice curriculum. I was told I must consider color when working with students, and by color, I mean their observable skin color. I was told I must take a student's identity into account when navigating student conflict, and by identity, I mean immutable characteristics. I was told I must participate in discussions about my own identity, my immutable characteristics. Res Life is also where I first learned about microaggressions. Does anyone here know what a microaggression is? Have you ever committed a microaggression? A lot? All right. Good for you. So here's the thing about a microaggression. If somebody accuses you, if a member of a marginalized group accuses you of a microaggression and you are part of a non-marginalized group, or you are a part of a marginalized group which is higher on the hierarchy, the oppression hierarchy than they are, then you are guilty. It could be a look, it could be an offhand comment. You might not even know they're in the room. It doesn't matter. If they accuse you of a microaggression, you are guilty. No due process, no evidence, without question. And during this time, I continued to receive messaging from the administration about race, power, privilege, inclusion, identity, diversity, etc., etc. Now again, this stuff had always made me a little nervous, but now it was making me a lot nervous. But I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why or what was happening. All I knew was that I had already left one job, and I was not going to leave another. As a single mother to 2 young boys, my aim, above all else, was to maintain stability for my family. That's it. I was determined to keep my head down and my mouth shut. But I was thinking a lot, and I turned my way to the way the college had responded to the students' Facebook post of July 31st, and started to piece together how their response had impacted me and other staff members, and I started to appreciate what it was like for my colleagues, especially the lower level employees at Smith, the custodians, the dining staff, all of the people that ensure the actual well-being of the student, the physical well-being of the student, all those people. Very important people, important job. And I realized that they were now understandably fearful of the students that they were taking care of. As a result of the knowledge that they work for an institution that does not have their back, one that was promoting this idea of microaggressions, and knowing that a student could accuse them of anything at any time, and poof, they're guilty. It struck me at this point that Smith had hurt the most vulnerable members of its community in order to maintain a false narrative that suited the most privileged members of its community, such as, for example, Umu Kanute. Because let's face it, the reality is, no matter where you come from, no matter what your skin color, no matter what your financial status, if you are a student at Smith College, you are privileged, period. Now, when I went back and read some of the letters Smith had issued at the time, I saw this hypocrisy on full display. In one of these letters, Smith says, "It does not tolerate race or gender-based discrimination of any kind because it can foster a climate of fear, hostility, and exclusion, and that has no place in our community." I agree with Smith. Such behavior can contribute to such a climate. In fact, that's exactly what happened. The irony is that it was not the caller to campus police who fostered this environment. It was the Smith administration itself. Smith had also created fertile soil in which further acts of discrimination were allowed to occur, not only occur, but justified. So this was probably around this is in 2019. We're in 2019 now. I had to come to terms with the fact that Smith College, my beloved alma mater, part of my identity, was not the institution that I thought it was. It was abusing its massive institutional power to gaslight and harm its employees and students. I was heartbroken. Equally troubling was that these moral failings were coming from my own tribe. They were coming from the left. So, my identity as a proud alum and lifelong liberal was officially challenged. And this is no small thing. In fact, I believe a majority of the people on the left, most of whom I believe do have a small voice inside them telling them something's not right, the reason they don't reflect on that voice or listen to it or investigate is because somewhere inside of them they know that on the other side of that is a massive identity crisis. So how did I do it? How did I do it? How did I extricate myself? Well, remember, it's 2019. I'm completely alone. I'm living in a town about, it's so far left, it's not even on the map. I'm surrounded by far leftists. I'm working at Smith College. All my friends believe in this stuff. But I had the internet. So I started to venture outside my information bubble. That's the first thing I did. And this, believe me, this is something very scary for somebody like me who had always bathed in the warm light of CNN. I remember the night, this is how hard it was for me to do this. I remember the night I closed my blinds, I turned off my lights, I grabbed my laptop, and underneath a blanket, I watched my first Jordan Peterson video. I did it. And I remember my surprise at what I found, which is a reasonable, level-headed, articulate man. Like, what's the big deal? I was encouraged by this, so I kept going. I paid very close attention when my colleagues would say that somebody in the public sphere is a, quote, white supremacist. I would write down their name, and I would go home and look them up to see for myself, because I thought, maybe they're actually cool. And more often than not, I found very sane, reasonable people. So I had other epiphanies at this time, such as I now knew that the reason I had a hard time understanding exactly what Smith meant when they used terms like social justice or systemic racism or inclusion was not because I'm dumb or because I have less education than the administration, but because they were using an entirely different dictionary than I was. I came to understand that this is not the same as this. you can see that. And that this is not the same as this. That's Rosa Parks. My conviction grew. I started to reach out to colleagues, behind closed doors, of course, and who confessed to me that they also thought this stuff was not so good. They agreed with me. Now, this was probably the most important thing to me, to have peers working in the same environment as I was validate what I was thinking, was perhaps the biggest step in building my moral conviction. And I want to mention another thing, because let's face it, my mother, the only one I was talking to before that time, she was sick of hearing about Smith College. I would call her up and say, guess what happened, and tell her what happened, and she'd say, that's weird. She could not understand what was happening. And this is another thing. People who don't work or live in environments captured by this ideology have no idea just how psychically destructive and crazy-making it can be. It's one thing to go on a podcast and talk about this stuff in a theoretical way. It's quite another to actually be working in such an environment. During this time, I was told by my supervisor I was expected to engage in authentic conversations about race. But by now, I understood that the reason these authentic conversations felt off to me is because they were not authentic at all. Clearly, there was a script. There were two of them, in fact, that everybody was expected to follow, depending on your skin color. There was one script for white people, and another script for people of color, which is everybody else, okay? White people and everybody else. These scripts are problematic in many ways, but here's two. One is, it doesn't do shit for people of color, okay? Or racism. Nothing. Two, the use of these scripts suggest and reinforce a very troubling dynamic in which the person of color is somehow dependent upon a white person to save or liberate them from oppression, merely by reciting a script. Now, I don't know about you, but this dynamic sounds familiar, and it makes me uncomfortable. I don't know if you know what this is. It's called a manumission certificate. It is a certificate, piece of paper signed by a slave owner freeing his slaves, or slave, granting the slave freedom. So a white slave owner granting the slave freedom. Are we starting to see the problem here? Any rhetoric that expects us to believe that people of color somehow depend upon white people to save or liberate them is not only condescending, it's definitely condescending. It's racist. It's called racism. And this relational dynamic is at the heart of social justice ideology. And the fact that this ideology depends upon maintaining the dynamic is interesting. A perfect example of this in action is my supervisor at the time. I went to her and I said, I'm not comfortable discussing my race at work. And she looked at me and she said, she happens to be black. She said, Jodi, you're lucky that because you're white, you don't have to talk about your skin color at work. You have the privilege of not having to talk about your skin color. She then went on to explain how she, as a black woman, is tailed by police on the highway simply because she's black, and she gets followed in stores. Now, that none of these things have anything to do with me didn't seem to matter. These things were happening to her outside of work, and I was nowhere in the vicinity. Didn't matter. What she was implying is that simply because I am white, that I am responsible for these things that are happening to her outside of work. And that if I talk about my skin color at work, somehow, magically, these things will stop happening to her outside of work. Now, again here, a troubling dynamic. It required me, It requires one to suspend the reality of their own senses, which is that has nothing to do with me. So by now I was starting to believe the reality of my own senses, which were screaming, this is bullshit. I wasn't going to do it anymore. By then I could see how going along with this was hurting me, not just me, but everyone, students, staff of all colors. My moral conviction was solid. I understood what was going on and what was wrong with the ideology. It only took me a few years to figure it out. And I decided I would no longer be discussing my skin color at work. Shortly after that, I was put to the test. In January 2020, I was required to attend a mandatory professional development meeting where the facilitators went around the room and one by one, asked us to answer the following questions. When they got to me, I politely declined, and I mean that. I was very polite and calm. I said, I'm not comfortable discussing my skin color at work. There was a pause. I was the only one to decline, and the workshop continued. However, a little while later, one of the facilitators said, I paraphrase, I want to be clear. Any discomfort or resistance by a white person to talking about their skin color when requested is not a sign of discomfort. It's a power play. It's called white fragility. You may want to comfort that person. They may seem like they're in distress, but they're not. It's a power play. And just like that, a line was crossed. Now I could not even abstain. Even my abstinence was framed as an act of racial aggression. Obviously, she was referring to me. I had been singled out and humiliated in front of my colleagues. And let me tell you, all the moral conviction in the world cannot spare you from the pain of a public shaming. It hurt. And that's why a public shaming, or even the threat of it, is so powerful. This, my friends, is how institutions like Smith College can persist in such legally and morally reprehensible behavior because we go along with it, either out of a desire to be seen as good, which is the carrot, or a desire to avoid being seen as bad or racist, which is the stick. Both are powerful motivators, and once established in the culture of a community, this becomes meaningless, the law. This is how the law becomes meaningless. So I was no longer in a position to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I'm sure you can understand why. I knew there would be more workplace discussions and that I would be expected to talk about my race. I knew my colleagues and supervisors would now be watching me closely to see what I would do, and I knew that if I did not comply, I would face more public humiliation. I had been labeled a betrayer of the ideology. I knew that. And I was understandably worried about retaliation at this point. I decided I had no choice but to file an internal complaint at Smith, which ostensibly protects one from retaliation. But what happened next was stunning, even to me. I went to meet with the EEOC officer who works at Smith, who processes complaints of racial discrimination. So ostensibly, she's knowledgeable in this area. She's the one who processes these complaints. And I told her what had happened in the library and in residence life. She listened quietly. She looked very surprised, actually. And she said, "Do you believe in white privilege?" I'm not going to tell you how I responded, but I will say what I know to be true, which is that, and this is a good answer if anyone asks you this, I do believe skin color privilege can and does exist. However, it is the context that determines which skin color shall confer privilege upon its bearer at any given time. And by now, it had been demonstrated to me that at Smith College, not only is having white skin not a privilege, it is a liability. And if you don't believe me, Just ask Mark Patnaud or Jackie Blair. The EEOC officer then informed me she would need to hire an outside investigator if I choose to proceed. I asked her why, aren't you the person that does this? And she said, well, she'd never handled a complaint like this before, and what she meant by that is because you're white, it's reverse discrimination, which is different. She then informed me that the Civil Rights Act of '64 was created to protect traditionally marginalized group of people. Well, I got the hint. What she was saying is that she does not believe white people are protected by civil rights law. I don't think anyone would blame me for losing faith at this point, but I did not. Remember, my moral conviction was strong, and I needed a job. I wanted to keep my job. So I proceeded with filing a complaint. Well, as soon as my superiors found out I was filing a complaint, the retaliation began. Job duties were assumed by others. I was excluded from important departmental meetings, and I was the only member of my department to be furloughed during the time of lockdowns when there were mass furloughs throughout the college. All of my colleagues remained employed. I was furloughed. I was also told in a pre-performance evaluation that I was lacking in the area of cultural competency, and my polite abstinence from discussing my skin color was cited as evidence for this lacking in cultural competency. So I submitted my final letter of complaint, which was almost 80 pages, in May of 2020, shortly before George Floyd's death. And that summer, the college upped the ante. During the time of mass furloughs and supposed budget problems, they announced their intention to pour money and energy into massive new programs, all aimed at racial justice. I was then told I would be expected to attend not one, but 2 meetings to discuss these initiatives, and I knew my feedback must be positive or else. Remember, I was afraid even to remain silent at this point. So with my complaint still pending in October, I filed it in May and it was October. I was told it would take 30 to 60 days. It was now October. And now being expected to attend meetings, I realized I was going to have to take drastic measures. I was going to have to even the playing field. So in October 2020, I released my first YouTube video. And in this video, I calmly explained the situation. I asked Smith to please stop engaging in racial prejudice against me and please stop asking me to do it to others. I was simply asking them to adhere to civil rights law. I don't think I was asking for much. The video went viral, and I soon found myself at the center of a national media firestorm. Unfortunately, instead of engaging with me about the content of my video, Smith doubled down. 2 days after the release of the video, they publicly humiliated me for a 3rd time in a letter to the community saying that I do not speak for the college or any part of the college. What they were saying is I am not part of the community at Smith, even though I am an alma mater, a graduate and was an employee at the time. For all their talk of inclusion and diversity, Smith had shown its hand. The investigation into my complaint was hurriedly concluded and, rather unsurprisingly, found no evidence of wrongdoing by Smith. I was then subjected to further retaliation, culminating in being placed under investigation. And by this time, I had suffered a lot. The college had publicly denounced me, and remember all those peers who agreed with me behind closed doors? They took a giant step back from me. My workplace had now become so hostile, I couldn't fathom working there any longer without a complete mental and physical breakdown. Remember, I am a single mother trying to raise 2 kids at home. On February 19th, 2021, I resigned publicly. My resignation letter was published by Barry Weiss in the Free Press, and 5 days later, I am very proud to say that largely due to my efforts, there was a front page New York Times article published about the July 31st incident and the way the college had mismanaged it. And if you haven't read this article, it's an excellent class analysis of what happened through the lens of class rather than race. It's good. So there's a lot more that certainly my ordeal went on after that, but we don't have 3 more hours. So I'm going to talk about what I learned from my experience at Smith. Now what? My experience at Smith taught me something very humbling. As you might imagine, this is a very humbling experience, which is that I am vulnerable. And I understand now what Matthias Desmet was saying. This really is not about politics. It really is about psychology. Freedom, as it turns out, is not a noun. It's a verb. It is not something you are. It is something you do. It's a process. And if you neglect to actively engage your brain in the process of freedom on a daily basis, you are vulnerable, just as I was, to manipulation. And you won't even know that you're being manipulated. At Smith, I saw how easily an idea, a theory, theories don't jump out of books and hurt people. People hurt people. This is an idea. How an idea can infect and capture entire swaths of a population. However, as some of you or many of you are probably well aware, the attack on freedom is shifting from the realm of ideas and from classic cult-like brainwashing tactics, such as the kind I experienced at Smith, to much more direct attacks. People like Elon Musk and the United States government are creating technology that can directly manipulate our thoughts and our behavior. There's no need for rhetoric. There's no need for propaganda. There's no need for an entire town, lefty town, to exert social influence. The fact that the state of Colorado has just passed a law designed to protect Coloradans' right to their own brainwaves is a sign of what's coming. So how do we maintain our freedom in such a world? Well, I think first we need to recognize this is not a matter of logic, will, or intelligence. It is a matter of focus, attention, and training. First, we must accept the humbling reality that simply by virtue of having a brain, that every single one of us is vulnerable. And this is because the human brain, by its very nature, is like flowing water. It is going to flow, no matter what. And if you don't direct the flow, somebody else will. Each of us is walking around with an operating system in our head, except unlike the kind found on a computer, we can't turn ours off. It's always on, absorbing and emitting information. And if you are not actively and attentively programming your own operating system, somebody else is. That's how the brain works. So how do we do this? Well, as far as I can tell from my experience, we can do this in 3 ways. There's probably more, but this is what I think. And it's no particular order. One is find an anchor beyond the realm of human beings. It could be God, it could be source, it could be nature, it could be your work. So you might think, my anchor is my kids. No, your anchor is not your kids. Your love for your kids is your anchor. Your anchor is not your job. Your anchor is your work ethic. For artists, your anchor is not the artwork you create. Your anchor is the act of creation. So never lose sight of your anchor. Number 2, train your brain, because your brain is designed to be trained. And if you're not training it, somebody else will. This is a matter of daily practice to focus your attention so your brain becomes what you want it to become. You can meditate, you can pray, the focused use of psychedelics, the reading of sacred texts, so on and so forth. We want to be mindful of where and what we put our attention on. And also careful of what kind of information we allow into our brain. Turn off the TV, turn off the phone, maybe give BitChute a break, chant, sing, play with your kids, so on and so forth. And lastly, find your people, which is what I think is what we're doing here today. We are social creatures. We cannot overestimate the power that the people around us have over who we are. They influence us. So be mindful of who you hang out with. I am still working to find my people. That is why I'm here at PorcFest and why I want to continue coming to PorcFest. Thank you very much for coming to my talk.